This is my true story. I raised my daughter alone after her mother died and gave her everything I possibly could, working 2 jobs to afford her private school and a beautiful wedding. When she married Derek, I moved into their home to help with the children and contribute however I could. But over 3 years, they treated me like a servant, making me clean and cook while mocking me in front of the grandchildren. Last month, my daughter cornered me and said I had 2 choices: obey her husband in his house or leave immediately. But she forgot one critical detail. You won't believe what happened next. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. I raised my daughter completely alone from the time she was 5 years old after her mother died in a terrible car accident that took her life instantly. I became both mother and father overnight, trying to fill roles I wasn't prepared for, while also grieving the loss of my wife. I poured every ounce of love and sacrifice and energy I had into giving my daughter the best life I possibly could, despite our circumstances. I worked 2 full-time jobs for years to afford sending her to private school, because I wanted her to have better opportunities than the public schools in our area could provide. I saved relentlessly, putting away every spare dollar I could for her college education, so she wouldn't be buried in student loan debt like so many young people. When she got engaged, I gave her a wedding that cost more money than I'd spent on myself in an entire decade. I wanted her special day to be perfect and memorable, so I paid for everything from the venue to the flowers to the catering to her dress. I went into debt to make sure she had the fairy tale wedding she'd always dreamed about since she was a little girl. I loved my daughter more than anything else in this world. She was my entire reason for breathing and working and pushing through difficult times. She was my purpose and my pride and the best thing that ever happened to me. I would have done absolutely anything for her without hesitation or complaint. I raised her to be kind and compassionate and grateful for what she had. I taught her to respect people regardless of their age or status. I showed her through my own example what unconditional love looked like by always being there for her, no matter what mistakes she made or problems she faced. I supported her dreams and encouraged her ambitions and celebrated her successes. I was there for every school play and sports game and parent-teacher conference. I helped her with homework late into the night. I dried her tears when boys broke her heart. I gave her advice when she needed guidance. I was the parent she could always count on. When she graduated college and started her career, I was so proud of the woman she'd become. She was smart and successful and independent. She met Derek and they seemed happy together, so I supported their relationship, even though something about him had always felt slightly off to me. But I ignored my instincts because my daughter loved him and I wanted her to be happy. When they got married, I welcomed Derek into our family with open arms, treating him like the son I'd never had. I thought we would all be one big happy family supporting each other through life's challenges. I never imagined that the unconditional love I'd given my daughter for her entire life could be taken so completely for granted. I never thought she would forget everything I'd sacrificed for her, or stop seeing me as her father, who deserved respect and dignity. I never believed she would allow anyone, including her husband, to treat me poorly without defending me or standing up for what was right. But that's exactly what happened over the years after she married Derek. The loving, grateful daughter I'd raised slowly disappeared and was replaced by someone I barely recognized. Someone who cared more about keeping her husband happy than honoring the father who'd given her everything. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs that I ignored at the time. The way she started prioritizing Derek's opinions over mine. The way she'd dismiss my concerns or suggestions with a wave of her hand. The way she stopped calling just to check on me or ask how I was doing. The gradual shift from treating me like her beloved father to treating me like an obligation she had to manage. But I made excuses for her behavior because I loved her so much. I told myself she was just busy with her new marriage and her career. I convinced myself things would get better once they settled into their life together. I was wrong about all of that. When my daughter married Derek 5 years ago, I welcomed him into our family with genuine warmth and acceptance, hoping he would be a good husband to her and a good addition to our small family. I tried my best to build a relationship with him, attending family dinners and offering to help them however I could as they started their new life together. About a year after their wedding, they invited me to move into their home after I'd made the difficult decision to sell my small apartment. They needed help with the down payment on a house they wanted to buy in a nice neighborhood, and I offered to contribute a significant amount of my savings to help them achieve their dream of homeownership. At first, when I moved in, everything seemed relatively fine between all of us. I tried to be helpful and contribute to the household in whatever ways I could. I'd help take care of their children when they were born, cooking meals for the family and doing light housework and babysitting whenever they needed to go out for date nights or work events. I tried to stay out of their way and not be intrusive or overbearing. I kept mostly to myself in my room when they wanted privacy. I contributed money toward groceries and utilities, even though they'd never asked me to. I genuinely thought we had a good arrangement where everyone benefited from the living situation. But Derek gradually became more controlling and dismissive toward me in ways that were subtle at first, but became more obvious over time. He'd make little comments about my habits or routines that felt critical and judgmental. He'd roll his eyes when I'd share stories about my daughter's childhood or offer suggestions about parenting. He'd change plans without telling me, leaving me waiting or confused about what was happening. He started treating me less like family who deserved respect and more like an inconvenience he was tolerating out of obligation to his wife. His tone when speaking to me became cold and impatient, like I was bothering him just by existing in his space. My daughter noticed Derek's treatment of me changing, but instead of defending me or setting boundaries with her husband, she began slowly adopting his contemptuous attitude toward me. She was so desperate to keep Derek happy and maintain peace in her marriage that she started seeing me through his eyes rather than remembering who I actually was to her. The father who'd raised her alone and worked 2 jobs and given her everything became someone she viewed as a burden rather than a blessing. She stopped standing up for me when Derek would make rude comments. She stopped checking on me to see if I was okay. She stopped treating me with the love and respect I'd shown her throughout her entire life. I watched my relationship with my daughter deteriorate as Derek's influence over her grew stronger. She started siding with him in every disagreement, even when he was clearly being unreasonable or cruel. She'd laugh nervously at his jokes made at my expense instead of telling him to stop. She'd agree with his complaints about me being in the way or taking up space, even though I tried so hard to be helpful and unobtrusive. It was like she'd completely forgotten that I was her father, who'd sacrificed everything for her happiness. She'd transformed into someone who cared more about pleasing her husband than honoring the parent who'd given her life and raised her with unconditional love. Derek became increasingly bold in his disrespect as he realized my daughter wouldn't push back or defend me. He'd openly mock me during family dinners, making cruel comments about my age, or my appearance, or my outdated opinions. He'd talk down to me like I was stupid or incompetent. He'd give me orders like I worked for him instead of being his elder and his wife's father. And my daughter would sit there silently watching her husband humiliate me without saying a single word in my defense. Sometimes she'd even join in with nervous laughter, trying to show Derek she was on his team rather than mine. Over the next 3 years, the mistreatment escalated from subtle dismissiveness into systematic humiliation that became part of my daily existence in their home. Derek would openly mock me at the dinner table in front of my grandchildren, calling me useless old man and making jokes about how I was too slow or too forgetful or too out of touch with the modern world. He'd criticize everything I did, from the way I loaded the dishwasher to the way I folded laundry to the way I talked to the children. Nothing I did was ever good enough in his eyes, and he made sure I knew it through constant criticism and belittling comments that chipped away at my dignity day by day. He started making me eat separately from the family when they had guests over for dinner parties or holiday celebrations. He'd tell me to take my plate to my room because having me at the table would make their important friends uncomfortable or ruin the atmosphere he was trying to create. I'd sit alone in my bedroom eating while I could hear laughter and conversation from downstairs, feeling like I was being punished for the crime of existing. My daughter never once objected to this treatment or insisted I be included with the rest of the family. She just went along with whatever Derek wanted, even when it meant excluding and humiliating her own father. The household duties gradually shifted until I was essentially being treated like hired help rather than family who lived there. Derek would give me lists of chores to complete each day, like cleaning bathrooms and vacuuming floors and doing everyone's laundry. He'd inspect my work and complain if things weren't done exactly to his standards. He'd make me serve their meals, bringing plates to the table and refilling drinks and clearing dishes while they sat and ate and talked without acknowledging me. My daughter, who'd grown up watching me work myself to exhaustion to provide for her now, sat silently while her husband turned me into their servant. I was expected to watch the children whenever Derek and my daughter wanted to go out, which was frequently. They'd leave for date nights or weekend trips or social events without asking if I was available or if I felt well enough to handle active young kids. They just assumed I'd be there to take care of their children because that's what I was useful for in their eyes. When I'd try to set boundaries or say I was too tired, Derek would get angry and tell me I owed them for letting me live in their house. My daughter would back him up, saying I should be grateful they'd taken me in, and this was the least I could do to contribute. The psychological abuse was constant and wearing me down more each day. Derek would criticize my appearance, saying I looked old and shabby and embarrassing. He'd mock my health problems and my need for medications, calling me a burden on the household. He'd make jokes about putting me in a nursing home where I belonged instead of cluttering up their house. And through all of this, my daughter stood silently nearby, sometimes even laughing nervously at his cruel jokes to show solidarity with her husband. The woman I'd raised to be kind and compassionate had become someone who enabled cruelty toward her own father without any apparent guilt or hesitation. I felt trapped in that situation because I'd sold my apartment and contributed so much money to their down payment. I had nowhere else to go and limited financial resources to start over. I told myself I had to endure this treatment for the sake of staying connected to my daughter and grandchildren. I convinced myself things might improve if I just tried harder to stay out of Derek's way and be more useful to them. But deep down, I knew the situation was only getting worse, and my daughter had chosen her husband's comfort over her father's dignity. I was living in a home where I'd helped pay the mortgage, but was treated like an unwelcome guest who'd overstayed their welcome. Last month, everything came to a head in a confrontation that would change our relationship forever. I was in the living room when I witnessed Derek being extremely harsh with my 6-year-old grandson over something minor that didn't warrant the severity of his reaction. He was screaming at the child and being physically rough, grabbing his arm and yanking him around in a way that seemed excessive and potentially harmful. I couldn't stay silent watching my grandson being treated that way, so I spoke up and questioned Derek about why he was being so harsh with such a young child. I suggested calmly that his discipline was too severe, and there were better ways to handle the situation. Derek exploded with rage the moment I questioned his parenting. His face turned red, and he started yelling at me about how I had no right to tell him how to raise his own children in his own house. He said I was overstepping and interfering and needed to mind my own business. He went on a tirade about how sick he was of me being there and constantly judging him and making his life difficult. The verbal assault was vicious and loud enough that the whole house could hear it. I tried to calm him down and explain I was just concerned about my grandson's well-being, but he wasn't interested in listening to anything I had to say. I expected my daughter to intervene and defend me, or at least try to de-escalate the situation. But instead, she came into the room and sided with Derek completely without even hearing my perspective. She looked at me with cold eyes that I'd never seen before and told me we needed to talk privately in my bedroom immediately. I followed her upstairs with a sinking feeling in my stomach, knowing something terrible was about to happen. She closed the door behind us and stood there with her arms crossed, looking at me like I was a problem that needed to be dealt with rather than her father who deserved respect. Then she said words that completely shattered my heart into pieces I wasn't sure could ever be put back together. Dad, you have two choices here. You can obey my husband in his house and stop questioning his decisions about how he runs his family. Or you can leave. We don't need you here causing problems and creating tension in our marriage. Derek is the head of this household, and what he says goes. If you can't accept that and follow his rules, then you need to find somewhere else to live. So choose right now. Obey him or leave. I stared at my daughter in complete shock, unable to believe these words were coming from the child I'd raised alone and sacrificed everything for. The daughter who'd grown up watching me work myself to exhaustion to give her opportunities. The daughter whose wedding I'd gone into debt to pay for. The daughter I'd helped buy this house by contributing a massive portion of my life savings. She was giving me an ultimatum like I was some troublesome tenant rather than her father who'd given her everything. She was telling me to obey her husband or get out without any acknowledgement of what I'd done for her or any gratitude for the years of sacrifice. The cold detachment in her eyes as she delivered that ultimatum was almost worse than the words themselves. There was no love or appreciation or even basic human compassion in her expression. She looked at me like I was a burden she was tired of carrying, like I was an obstacle to her husband's happiness that needed to be removed, like our entire history together meant nothing compared to keeping Derek satisfied. In that moment, I realized my daughter had stopped seeing me as her father, who deserved honor and respect. She'd started seeing me as someone disposable, whose feelings and dignity didn't matter as long as her husband was happy. I stood there in my bedroom looking at my daughter who'd just given me an ultimatum to obey her husband or leave his house. I looked at this woman who used to be the baby I'd rocked through endless sleepless nights when she had colic and couldn't settle. The child I'd worked 2 full-time jobs to support so she could have private school education and opportunities I never had. The teenager I'd stayed up late helping with college applications and scholarship essays. The young woman whose wedding I'd bankrupted myself to fund because I wanted her special day to be perfect. And I realized she'd forgotten one absolutely critical detail about this entire situation. I spoke quietly but clearly so there would be no misunderstanding about what I was saying. His house? This isn't Derek's house. This house doesn't belong to your husband at all. It's mine. I'm the one whose name is on the title and the deed. I'm the one who paid the down payment with money from selling my apartment. I'm the one who's been covering the mortgage payments for the past 3 years while you've been treating me like a servant in my own property. This is my house, not his, and not yours. I watched the color drain completely from my daughter's face as the memory of how this house was actually purchased came crashing back over her. She'd apparently gotten so comfortable living here and so aligned with Derek's perspective that she'd completely forgotten the basic facts about who owned the property. 3 years ago, when they wanted to buy this house, they didn't have enough money for the down payment or good enough credit to qualify for the mortgage on their own. I had stepped in and bought the house in my name using my excellent credit and my savings. I had let them live here while planning to eventually transfer ownership to them as part of my estate when I died. But I had never actually completed that ownership transfer. I had never signed over the deed or changed the title. Some instinct deep inside me had warned me to wait and not rush into making that legal change. Maybe subconsciously, I'd sensed even back then that things might not work out the way I hoped. Maybe some part of me knew I needed to protect myself and my assets. Whatever the reason, I'd held off on finalizing the transfer, and the house had remained legally mine for all 3 years they'd been living here. You forgot this was my house, I continued, speaking in that same quiet, steady voice. You just gave me an ultimatum in a home you thought belonged to you and Derek, but it never did. You told me to obey your husband in his house or leave. But this isn't his house, it's mine. So I'm making my choice right now. I'm choosing to leave just like you suggested. But I'm not leaving my house behind for you to keep living in after treating me this way. I'm taking my house with me. My daughter's face went from pale to panicked as she started to understand the implications of what I was saying. She stammered, trying to backtrack and say she didn't mean it the way it sounded. She said she was just stressed and didn't think before she spoke. She said of course she knew it was my house, and she appreciated everything I'd done. But her words rang hollow after years of watching her enable Derek's cruelty and participate in my humiliation. After giving me an ultimatum to obey her husband or get out like I was some unwanted stranger. After siding with him over me again and again despite everything I'd sacrificed for her. I told her I'd made my decision, and it was final. I was leaving this house and this toxic situation. And since the house was legally mine and I'd been paying the mortgage, I was going to do whatever I wanted with my property. She could stay for now, but that would be changing very soon. Then I walked out of that bedroom, leaving her standing there in shock. I walked past my daughter out of the bedroom and went straight back downstairs, where Derek was still in the living room. He looked up at me with that smug expression he always had after he'd gotten his way and put me in my place. He clearly expected my daughter had delivered the message, and I'd either agreed to fall in line and obey him, or I'd be packing my bags to leave like some defeated old man with nowhere else to go. What he didn't expect was what I said next, standing there in the middle of their living room with my daughter coming down the stairs behind me looking panicked. "This house is mine," I said loudly enough for both of them to hear clearly. "My name is on the title. My credit got the mortgage. My money paid the down payment. I've been covering the mortgage payments for 3 years. You've been living in my house rent-free while treating me like garbage. Well, that's about to change. I'm leaving like you wanted, and I'm selling my house. You have whatever time the law requires to find somewhere else to live because I'm done being humiliated in property that belongs to me." The expression on Derek's face shifted from smug confidence to confusion to dawning horror as he processed what I'd just said. He started to argue, saying that couldn't be right, and this was their house, they'd bought it together. But I cut him off and told him to check the deed and the mortgage documents if he didn't believe me. Everything was in my name. They'd been living here as my guests for 3 years. Guests who'd repaid my generosity by treating me like a servant and mocking me and giving me ultimatums about obeying the man who thought he owned property he'd never paid for. My daughter tried to intervene, saying we should all calm down and talk about this rationally. She said there must be some kind of misunderstanding or miscommunication. She suggested maybe we could work something out where everyone was happy. But I was done talking and done trying to work things out with people who'd shown me nothing but contempt. I'd spent 3 years trying to be helpful and stay out of their way and earn the right to exist in my own house. 3 years of being treated like I was lucky they tolerated my presence. That ended today. I told them both I was going upstairs to my room to make some phone calls, and they should start thinking about where they wanted to move because this house would be sold as quickly as possible. Derek started yelling about how I couldn't do this, and it wasn't fair, and they had children to think about. I turned back and reminded him he should have thought about his children before he spent years humiliating their grandfather in his own home. I reminded him he gave me the choice to obey him or leave. I was choosing to leave and taking my property with me. He'd made his bed, and now he'd have to sleep in it somewhere other than my house. My daughter followed me upstairs, begging me to reconsider and saying she was sorry for how things had been. She said she'd talk to Derek about changing his behavior and treating me better. She promised things would be different if I just gave them another chance. But I looked at her standing there desperate and scared, and I remembered the cold eyes she'd had just 20 minutes earlier when she gave me that ultimatum. I remembered 3 years of watching her laugh at Derek's cruel jokes. I remembered being excluded from family dinners and treated like hired help. I remembered her siding with her husband every single time, even when he was clearly wrong. I told her it was too late for apologies and promises. The damage was done and couldn't be undone. She'd chosen Derek over me repeatedly for years. She'd taken my unconditional love and sacrifices for granted. She'd forgotten who paid for this house and who'd been supporting them. Now she'd remember. Now they'd both remember what they'd lost. I went to my bedroom and closed the door behind me, while my daughter and Derek panicked downstairs, arguing loudly about what they were going to do. I could hear Derek yelling at her, asking how she could forget whose name was on the house and why she never told him I was the actual owner. I could hear her crying and trying to defend herself, saying she'd just assumed the house had been transferred to them or that it didn't matter since we were family. But their argument didn't concern me anymore. I had more important things to focus on than their marital problems. I pulled out my phone and called a real estate agent I'd worked with years ago when I sold my apartment. She answered on the second ring and seemed surprised but happy to hear from me after so many years. I explained my situation in basic terms, without going into all the emotional details. I told her I owned a house that I needed to sell as quickly as possible, and I wanted to list it immediately for cash offers only with a short closing period. She asked a few questions about the location and size and condition of the property. When I gave her the address, she got excited because she said that neighborhood was extremely hot right now, with buyers competing for houses. She came over the next morning to do a walkthrough and take photos while my daughter and Derek watched nervously from the kitchen. The agent was professional and efficient, measuring rooms and noting features and taking pictures for the listing. She told me based on recent comparable sales in the area and the current market conditions, we should list the house for $2.9 million. She said we'd likely get multiple offers within days because inventory was so low and demand was so high. She was confident we could close within 30 days if we found a cash buyer who didn't need financing. I signed the listing agreement right there at the kitchen table while Derek stood there with his mouth open in shock. My daughter kept trying to talk to me, asking me to please reconsider and think about what I was doing. She said the children would be traumatized by having to move. She said they couldn't afford to find another place this nice on such short notice. She begged me to at least give them more time to figure things out. But I ignored her pleas and focused on signing the paperwork the agent had brought. The house would be listed that afternoon and would go live on all the major real estate websites by evening. True to the agent's prediction, we had 3 serious offers within 48 hours of the listing going live. All 3 were cash offers from buyers who wanted quick closings with minimal contingencies. The highest offer was $2.8 million from a young couple who'd been searching for months and were willing to pay premium price to secure the property. They wanted to close in 30 days and were offering to buy the house as is without requesting any repairs or credits. It was the perfect offer for my situation. I accepted that offer immediately, and my agent started the process of getting all the paperwork together for closing. My lawyer, who I'd called the same day I listed the house, had already prepared eviction papers for my daughter and Derek. Since they weren't on the title and had no legal claim to the property and had never paid rent, they were essentially squatters who I could remove. My lawyer served them with official notice that they had 30 days to vacate the premises. If they weren't gone by the closing date, the sheriff would forcibly remove them and their belongings. The reality of the situation hit my daughter hard when she received those eviction papers. She realized I wasn't bluffing or trying to scare them into better behavior. I was actually selling the house they'd been living in and kicking them out with only 30 days to find somewhere else to live. 3 years of taking my generosity for granted had finally caught up with them. The house sale was just the beginning of what my daughter and Derek had forgotten or never known about my financial situation. They'd apparently assumed I was some poor old man living off a modest pension who'd given them everything I had when I helped with their down payment. They thought selling my small apartment and moving in with them meant I was broke and dependent on their charity. They had absolutely no idea about the wealth I'd been quietly building over 40 years of careful investing and disciplined saving. I'd never been one to brag about money or show off what I had, so they'd never bothered to ask questions about my actual financial position. Over my entire working career as an engineer, I'd lived well below my means and invested aggressively in retirement accounts and index funds and real estate. I'd started saving and investing when I was in my 20s and had maintained that discipline through 4 decades of compound growth. Every raise I got at work went straight into investments. Every bonus got invested. Every tax refund got invested. I drove old cars and wore modest clothes and lived in a small apartment because I didn't care about impressing people with material possessions. I cared about building wealth that would give me security and options later in life. The result of all that saving and investing was that I had $5.2 million in various investment accounts, retirement funds, and property holdings that my daughter knew absolutely nothing about. She'd never asked about my finances because she'd assumed after I sold my apartment and helped them with their down payment that I'd given away everything I had. She thought I was living with them out of necessity rather than choice. She had no idea I could have easily bought my own place or lived anywhere I wanted. I'd moved in with them because I wanted to be close to my grandchildren and help my daughter, not because I needed their charity. When I combined the $2.8 million from selling their house with the $5.2 million I already had in investments, I was looking at $8 million in total liquid assets. $8 million that I could do whatever I wanted with. $8 million that my daughter had expected to inherit someday, but would now never see because of how she'd treated me. That money represented decades of hard work and sacrifice and smart financial decisions. And I was about to use it to disappear from her life completely. My daughter had always assumed she'd inherit everything when I died because she was my only child. She'd probably imagined getting the house and whatever savings I had and being set financially. She'd never asked me directly about my estate planning or what I had, but I could see the assumption in how she treated me. She tolerated Derek's cruelty and participated in my humiliation partly because she thought she just had to wait for me to die, and then everything would be hers. She thought she could treat me terribly and still get my money eventually. But what she didn't understand was that inheritance isn't automatic or guaranteed. I could choose to leave my money to anyone or anything I wanted. I could donate it all to charity. I could set up trusts for my grandchildren that she'd never control. I could spend every penny before I died traveling the world and living in luxury. The money was mine to do with as I pleased, and her treatment of me had just eliminated any chance she had of benefiting from it. She'd gambled that she could abuse me and still inherit my wealth. She was about to find out she'd lost that gamble completely. I started making plans for what I'd do with my $8 million once the house sale closed and I was free from their toxic household. I'd always wanted to retire somewhere peaceful and beautiful, where I could live out my remaining years with dignity and respect. Somewhere far away from the daughter who'd broken my heart and the son-in-law who'd treated me like garbage. Somewhere they'd never find me or bother me again. Within those 30 days between accepting the offer and the closing date, I'd been extremely busy making arrangements for my complete disappearance from my daughter's life. I researched countries that offered retirement visas or residency programs for people with significant financial assets who wanted to relocate permanently. I discovered that New Zealand had an excellent retirement investor visa program that granted residency to people over a certain age who could invest a minimum amount in the country and prove they had sufficient income to support themselves. The program was perfect for my situation, and I qualified easily with my $8 million in assets. I hired an immigration attorney who specialized in New Zealand visas and started the application process immediately. The attorney was efficient and knowledgeable, guiding me through all the paperwork and requirements. Within 2 weeks, I had approval in principle for my retirement visa, pending the final investment and background checks. I started looking at properties in New Zealand through online real estate websites and video tours with local agents. I found a beautiful home overlooking the ocean in a quiet coastal town that was absolutely perfect for what I wanted. 3 bedrooms, modern kitchen, large windows with stunning water views, peaceful neighborhood with other retirees. I made an offer on that New Zealand property, and it was accepted within days. The purchase price was considerably less than what I was getting for the house in the States, which meant I'd have plenty of money left over for living expenses and enjoying my retirement. I arranged for the purchase to close just a few days after my house sale would close here, so the timing would work out perfectly. I hired a property management company in New Zealand to handle the closing on my behalf and make sure everything was ready for my arrival. I booked a one-way plane ticket for the day after my house closing. I also made arrangements to have all my financial affairs managed remotely through my investment advisors and accountants. I set up online banking and automatic bill payments for everything. I arranged for my mail to be forwarded to a private mailbox service that would scan important documents and email them to me. I disconnected my US phone number and got a new international phone with a New Zealand number that nobody from my old life would have. I closed my social media accounts so my daughter couldn't track me or contact me through those platforms. The only person who knew my full plans and my future contact information was my lawyer, who I'd been working with for years. I gave him power of attorney to handle any remaining legal or financial matters in the United States on my behalf. I instructed him explicitly that he was not to share my location or contact information with my daughter under any circumstances. If she tried to reach me through him, he was to tell her I'd relocated and didn't wish to be contacted. He was loyal and trustworthy, and I knew he'd follow my instructions exactly. The day before the house closing, I packed my essential belongings into 2 suitcases. Everything else I owned I either donated or threw away. I didn't need furniture or dishes or most of my clothes because the New Zealand property was fully furnished, and I'd buy new things there. I wanted to start completely fresh without dragging remnants of my old life with me. I spent that final night in a hotel near the airport, rather than staying in the house where my daughter and Derek were scrambling to pack their own belongings. On the morning of the closing, I went to my lawyer's office and signed all the final paperwork transferring ownership of the house to the buyers. The $2.8 million was wired to my account within hours. That afternoon, I left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter of the now empty house, where I knew my daughter would find it when she came by one last time. The note I left on the kitchen counter was short and direct because I didn't want to waste words on people who'd wasted years of my life treating me like garbage in my own home. I wrote exactly what I needed to say, and nothing more. You told me to obey your husband or leave your house. You forgot it was never your house. It was always mine. I've sold it for $2.8 million, and I'm leaving the country with the $8 million total you didn't know I had. You took my unconditional love for granted for years. You let your husband humiliate me daily. You gave me an ultimatum in property I owned. Now you can take your contempt and find somewhere else to live it. Don't try to find me. I'm gone. I left that note on the counter and walked out of that house for the last time. I drove straight to the airport and boarded my flight to New Zealand. During the long flight, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief and liberation. Sadness because I'd lost my daughter to her husband's influence and her own selfishness. Relief because I was finally free from years of psychological abuse and humiliation. Liberation because I was starting a completely new chapter of my life in a beautiful country where nobody knew me or my history. I was leaving behind everything painful and embracing a future where I'd be treated with the dignity and respect I deserved. My daughter started trying to contact me almost immediately after finding that note. She called my old phone number hundreds of times, but it was already disconnected and went straight to an automated message saying the number was no longer in service. She sent emails to my old email address that I'd set to auto-delete without reading. She posted desperate messages on social media before I deleted all my accounts begging me to contact her and saying she didn't mean any of it and she was sorry. She claimed she'd been under stress and Derek had changed and things would be different. But I never saw most of those messages because I'd already cut off every avenue she had to reach me. She apparently tried contacting my lawyer demanding to know where I'd gone and how to reach me. My lawyer followed my instructions perfectly and told her only that I'd relocated internationally and didn't wish to be contacted by her. He refused to provide any additional information, no matter how much she begged or threatened. She tried hiring a private investigator to track me down, but there was no trail to follow. I'd covered my tracks carefully and disappeared completely from her life, the same way she'd tried to erase me from hers through years of mistreatment. From updates my lawyer sends me, occasionally I've learned that my daughter and Derek's marriage fell apart rapidly under the financial pressure and mutual blame. They couldn't afford to buy or even rent another house as nice as mine in that neighborhood. They ended up in a small apartment in a less desirable area that they could barely afford. Derek blamed my daughter for losing the house by not managing me better. My daughter blamed Derek for being cruel to me and causing this entire disaster. The resentment between them grew until their marriage collapsed under the weight of it. Last I heard, they were divorced, and she was living as a single mother struggling financially. I live now in New Zealand in my beautiful home overlooking the Pacific Ocean. I wake up every morning to stunning views and peaceful quiet. I spend my days reading and walking on the beach and enjoying hobbies I never had time for before. I've made friends in the local community who treat me with kindness and respect. My $8 million funds a comfortable, dignified life where nobody mocks me or treats me like a servant. Nobody tells me to obey them or get out. Nobody makes me eat separately or clean their house or watch their children while they party. I have the peace and dignity I deserved all along. My daughter told me to obey her husband or leave his house. She forgot it was my house that I'd bought and paid for while she and Derek lived there rent-free. So I sold my house for $2.8 million, combined it with $5.2 million she never knew I had, and moved to New Zealand with $8 million total. She had 30 days to vacate. She took my unconditional love and decades of sacrifice for granted. She chose her husband's comfort over her father's dignity. Now she lives with the consequences of that choice, while I live in peace on the other side of the world, where she'll never find me. Some daughters inherit their father's wealth. Mine inherited the lesson that unconditional love has limits, and she found mine when she gave me that ultimatum in my own home.